It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Admiral Scott Swift is a graduate of San Diego State University. He's an Aztec, 1979. Took command of the fleet in Pearl Harbor, 27 May 2015. He is the 35th commander of the Pacific Fleet since its inception in February 1941. He's responsible for providing combat-ready forces forward to naval component commanders and combatant commanders around the globe in support of U.S. interests. A career naval aviator, he has commanded at every level from lieutenant commander to 4 stars, including commander of Strike Fighter Attack Squadron VFA 97, commander of Air Wing 14, commander of Strike Group 9, and commander of the U.S. 7th Fleet. Prior to assuming command at Pearl Harbor, he was director of the Navy staff in the Pentagon. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Admiral Scott Swift.
Thanks, Pete. Appreciate it. Well, it's great to be here with you this afternoon. Unfortunately, I got tied up this morning and I was unable to meet to attend Admiral Branch's presentation. I wish I'd been there because I heard nothing but great things about it, and I feel like I'm a little set up now with high expectations that he set and the challenge on delivering those expectations. So I'm going to keep my comments short, and I appreciate the West team here in what they've done in teeing up this broad opportunity. And just to give you some insights as to the impact of West, Pete and I, when we saw each other this morning for the first time, just probably about an hour, 45 minutes ago, I congratulated him on where West was and how much they had accomplished already. He says, whoa, hey, wait a minute, we just barely got started here. So I ran through him a litany of things that have occurred just since my arrival yesterday evening. So my good friend Admiral Takei is here as the MSO from the JMSDF. And he is here because of West, and he had a meeting yesterday afternoon with Admiral Tyson, the 3rd Fleet Commander, a great engagement. This morning I had an engagement with the majority of flags here that are in San Diego to talk about the warfighting development centers and where we need to go as a Navy in continuing to build out what those centers will bring to us from a warfighting perspective. And Admiral Roden was a little late coming to the meeting because he was in a meeting with Admiral Takei talking about how we can collaborate and coordinate even more closely than we already do between U.S. Navy forces and the JMSDF forces as well. And then this is a great opportunity to share some of my thoughts up front, but more important, get to the questions that are on your mind. So there's a few things that I want to run to. The format that I'm going to walk this through, I'm going to talk generally in terms of what I call messaging the mainland, kind of big themes that I'm working on as the PAC Fleet Commander. I'm going to talk a little bit about an update on what's going on in the region from my perspective. It seems like you can't go anywhere without getting pulled into a conversation if you don't start it yourself about distributed lethality. I'm not going to talk a lot about distributed lethality. I want to touch on it, but I want to talk about a broader concept that I think distributed lethality nests within at a high operational, low strategic level, which I'm calling full spectrum dominance. And it's interesting, in Secretary Carter's speech of 2 February, he talked about spectrum dominance when he rolled out his vision for the budget. And I think it's important. He talked about thinking and getting after the problem set that we face from a cognitive perspective. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we can do better as a team, between a uniform team and an industry team, and some frustrations that I have through no one's fault, certainly within this room, but driven by some realities that I think have driven us to positions that are more polarized than they need to be. So let me talk a little bit about, on the first theme about messaging the mainland, about rebalance and refocus. So I'm bringing it up now because if I didn't, it for sure would be a question. So when we talk about rebalance, I think in terms of hardware. Rebalance is the stuff. You know, you can probably run through the speaking points better than I can. 60% of the Navy is going to be forward in the Pacific Fleet, either here on the West Coast or in Hawaii or as part of our FDNF force. So it's about the structure. It's about the latest and greatest in hardware. CAG-5 is the most modern air wing that we have in the Navy. The DDGs and the cruisers forward are the most modern cruisers and DDGs that we have in the Navy. The submarine force that operates out of here in San Diego, Hawaii, and Guam, some of our most modern platforms. That's what the rebalance is about. And as new platforms come out, we're about 57, 58% there. And people often ask me, well, why don't you just get to the 60% right off the bat? And it's because we're still building it. You know, it's DDG 1000 that's on its way. It's more LCSs that are on its way. And it's new platforms like JSF that are on its way. And in fact, JSF will make its first operational deployment with the Marines. It'll deploy to Iwakuni, shortly followed by WASP, which is going through modification right now to accept JSF Bravos. WASP will arrive shortly after the JSF Bravos do and embark and start that first integrated deployment forward in the Pacific. That's some examples about rebalance. Let me talk to you about what the refocus is. The refocus is what, in my mind, what SecDef was talking about getting mentally focused. So it's things like when Admiral Tyson took over Third Fleet, relieving Admiral Floyd, I made the comment that I didn't understand why we were so allegiant to the international date line as a demarcation between Third Fleet and Seventh Fleet. And in fact, as a Pacific Fleet commander, as I traveled around the region talking to allies, partners, and friends, when they were talking about the power of Pacific Fleet, inevitably it turned into a conversation about the power of Seventh Fleet. And the power of Third Fleet was largely lacking from the description. The Pacific Fleet is the combined power of Third and Seventh Fleet. And the comments that I made at NORA's change of command and the comments that I've continued to make since is about deploying Third Fleet forward. In a virtual sense initially, but in an actual sense in the Aegis. I'm not talking about changing flagpoles. I'm not talking about changing home ports of ships. I'm not talking about PCS moves. It's about empowering the Third Fleet staff, which has always been very capable, but getting it out from underneath that brand of being a man, train, and equipped staff. So I've known Pink Floyd for a long time, and when I was DNS, I sent him an email, and I talked about, hey, I need to better understand exactly what you're doing as Third Fleet from a man, train, and equipped perspective. And I got a quick email back almost instantly, and he goes, I'm not sure what address you meant to send that to, but I'm not a man, train, and equipped kind of guy. And I got the message. I got the message pretty quick. So it's about taking action. That's another comment that SecDef said. My words, not his. Feel free to stop admiring the problem and start getting to solutions. So there's, in fact, this is a discussion that Admiral Takei had with Admiral Tyson yesterday about him wanting to better understand what this relationship, what is this structure going to look like between Third and Seventh Fleet. So we don't have those answers yet. And that's okay. That's about getting after the problem. But Admiral Alcoin was busy in Korea covering down on a sea power conference there when Japan had their International Fleet Review. So Admiral Tyson went forward and represented me as the Pacific Fleet commander on the carrier and Reagan that participated in that fleet review. That's one example. Shortly, she's going to go to an event in New Zealand, and seeing my good friend John Martin, who's just taken over the New Zealand Navy, and engaged down there. And then I've asked her if she would continue on after I had a discussion with Tim Barrett, the chief of the Australian Navy, if she would go visit the fleet commander in Sydney and start working through what does this look like from a C2 perspective as far as having Third Fleet forward. Admiral Rowden's doing some really interesting things. We do independent deployers, been doing that for a long time. So we said, well, why don't we pull together some independent deployers, form them into a SAG, and send them out as a group. So we, in fact, are doing that, and we're going to do that exercising the command and control from Third Fleet as it transitions into 7th Fleet. Stennis is out and about now in the Pacific. She's in Guam right now as we speak, and then she'll be getting underway again after completing some training around Guam. And we're going to do a change of command of that carrier strike group. And Nora is going to go out and officiate over that change of command, as you would expect. Both those strike groups are home ported here on the West Coast. So those are just a couple examples of what I'm thinking of when in the context of refocusing our attention in the Pacific. Part of that rebalance and refocus is affirmation of the fact that the Navy is a global force facing global challenges. We have this ongoing discussion at senior levels in the Navy of how do we cover down on all these requirements that we get from COCOMs for naval forces, Navy and Marine. And it struck me, this is a good place to be. So when you have a global force management discussion in the tank with the chairman sitting over it, invariably the discussion centers around naval forces, and it has to do with the fact that we're a mobile force. We bring our tooth and our tail with us together, and we're ready to operate on arrival. And oh, by the way, we have immediate effect as soon as the word is put out that we're headed in a general direction. So there was an immediate impact when the press release, when the articles were written about Stennis getting underway from San Diego and heading out to the Pacific. Now, that departure date had been long planned through the OFRP process, but the region immediately connected with the missile launches out of North Korea. So the strategic impact of naval forces is significant. Now, we did some interesting things with F-22 as well. Deployed them into Japan, and now we deployed them forward into Osan. But it's that throw weight of naval forces that has the greatest impact in the theater. And it's about our mobility being our greatest strength, and the fact that we are the force that's most in demand by COCOMs. We should think in terms of that and recognize that as the value that we bring to the nation, affirmation of that value that we bring to the nation. So how do we maintain this view of risk with this competition? So I talk on a regular basis about risk and the importance of managing risk. The first thing that we need to do is we need to own risk. I think as a culture, I don't think it's unique to the Navy. I think it's true of all services, but I'll speak to what I know, and that's the Navy side. We are too risk adverse as a culture. Risk is about warfighting. It's an inherent part of warfighting. It's an element that we should be embracing as opposed to an element that we need to drive to zero. We are no longer in a resource environment where we can afford to put the resources against any level of risk and drive it down to the levels that we've been able to in the past. And there's two resources that I'm talking about. One is money, so we don't have that money to spend down resource. And the other is people. We still have a very stressed force, both sailors and Marines, including our civilian sailors. So we've got to own risk. An example of taking ownership of it is my staff has a hard problem getting RFFs through me. In fact, I think they brought one to me the entire time that I've been as the commander. Because RFFs, in my mind, are an affirmation that we're not willing to embrace risk and accept that. So what I do as the Pac Fleet Commander is I turn risk in two ways. One channel is up to the CNO, and I said, CNO, here's what I've been asked to do. Here's the resources that I have. Here's what the gap is. I'm okay with it. I'm not asking for more. I'm just telling you what the risk is. And then the other customer that I work for is Admiral Harris, and I describe that risk to him. And again, with the view of this is what the process that I'm going to go through, this is how I'm going to manage that level of risk. We've got to get beyond this culture of leaping from crisis to crisis. Again, I think that's what SecDef was talking about. At least that's what it resonated with me in his 2 February speech when he was talking about being more thoughtful. In fact, we go from crisis to crisis, which means we get caught in this conundrum of commanders saying, I'm tired of being reactive all the time. You know, we need to be more proactive. Well, you need space to think. If you're jumping from crisis to crisis, I mean, if you don't like the crisis you're in, you know, what I tell the staff is wait 5 minutes, and there's going to be another crisis that's going to show up at the doorstep, and maybe that one will be a little more palatable. But it's not enough to say we want to go from reactive to proactive. Where we need to go is from proactive to predictive. And at certainly my level of command, at the PAC fleet level, at the Echelon 2 level, we need to raise ourselves above that fray that goes back and forth on a daily basis at the tactical level and spend time thinking. So when someone brings me a crisis, that's not necessarily my crisis to engage on. Other people are working that. It's if I see a series of events that begins to cause concerns that I get engaged on. So I'm talking about some of the challenges from an operational perspective. The biggest thing that I focused on, it's not what I spend the majority of my personal time on, but it's what I touch on with the greatest frequency, and that's readiness. So hopefully this will get back to Admiral Gortney. So you know Admiral Gortney's readiness kill chain. And what I want to get back to Shortney is that he only got half the equation right. So remember where he was when he came up with that. He was at FFC, and it was all about producing readiness. And that's what the readiness kill chain was all about. And he's a warfighter. So he took a system that delivers readiness from purchasing raw materials all the way until that widget could be chambered into a weapon system and fired downrange, or that part could be put into a piece of the weapon system that was broken. That was a readiness kill chain. What he missed was there's an equal sign at the end of that to make the equation complete, he needed to finish what was on the other side. And that's my kill readiness chain. That's the KRC. We've got to get both those things in balance. So we talk about producing readiness. How often do we talk about consuming readiness? If people ask me what's the power of Pacific Fleet, I'm one of the few commanders that owns both sides of that equation. You know, I'm that guy that says, how can we be out of money? I still got checks. And then the staff comes to me and says, well, you own the bank account as well. You know, we've done too much with what we've had. So it's about balancing that equation of production and consumption. And we have this discussion on a regular basis, certainly with the TICOMs that report to me. When we talk about discovery of maintenance that's required every time we crack a ship open or an aircraft open, invariably there's discovery that occurs, things that we did not directly anticipate and fund to. And the term that I use to describe this conundrum that we're in is resetting in stride. So we have, as a naval force, we have not had the benefit of returning to garrison and resetting. Our op tempo is the same as it was during OIF and OEF. Your Navy is out and about all across the world, operating with the same intensity today as it was 5 years ago and 10 years ago. So we have got to reset that force in stride, which is not easy. That's what's critical about the OFRP, but I'm not going to go into more detail on that. But that's what one of my major challenges is, how do we reset the force in stride. Let me move on to the second point, which is some regional challenges that we face. So I was recently in India, and there's a dialogue that goes along in academic circles of you know, how do we characterize the PAC Fleet Theater? You know, is it the Asia Pacific or is it the Indo-Asia Pacific? Well, as far as I'm concerned, it's the Indo-Asia Pacific. And I brought that up with India because a lot of times people will say, well, the Indians are a little concerned about being lumped in with the Asia Pacific thing. Well, they're not concerned now because the Asia Pacific is now flowing into the Indian Ocean. And I used the analogy when I was there talking to some think tanks in an op-ed piece that I wrote for a newspaper in New Delhi, that as I stand in the Malacca Straits and I look west, I see, what you could characterize as a sea of tranquility, the Indian Ocean. And then I turn around and I look east, and it's a very different sight picture. I've changed after having spent some time in India and talking to leadership there, Admiral Doan, the chief of the Indian Navy, and others. I then went to Bangladesh and participated in a Indian Ocean Naval Symposium there where there were leaders from really all around the region, including Europe as well. And my thinking has changed a little bit. Instead of the optic of standing in the Malacca Straits and looking east and west, I stand in the middle of the Indian Ocean and look west into the Mediterranean, into the Black Sea, into Europe, and see those forces of instability at play there. Whether it's just the immigration piece, take Russia off the table and just talk about the immigration piece and look at the instability and the struggles that are going through the countries in Europe are going through. And then I turn around and I look east and I see the instability that is apparent on a daily basis on the front pages of papers everywhere, more so certainly in the Pacific, with respect to the instability in the Pacific. So the bottom line is, as I look in those areas of instability, I continue to espouse the importance of maintaining allegiance to the international norms, standards, rules, and laws that have ensured the security for the region since the end of World War II. And there were a number of conventions that were called after World War II. America was the sponsor of those conventions, but multiple countries from the regions participate. There was one in Europe, there was one in San Francisco that dealt with the Pacific. And not only were those norms, standards, rules, and laws developed there, but the institutions to resolve differences as recognizing that the region would grow and change, the environment would change. Institutions were developed to allow countries to resolve frictions and differences that they had with each other on a whole myriad of issues, not just military issues or territorial issues, across economic issues, diplomatic issues. So that level of allegiance to those norms, standards, rules, and laws, I think, is what's critically important. I think, quite frankly, is what's being challenged in the region. I don't think it's about resources. That's additive to it, but it's really about the norms, standards, rules, and laws, and then taking advantage of the mechanisms to resolve those. If you look in the Indian Ocean and people ask me, well, why is there such a difference in the Indian Ocean? I look at the territorial disputes that were between Bangladesh and India. India, huge country, huge army, huge navy, huge air force, huge population, huge economy, certainly compared to Bangladesh. And yet India decided to take advantage of one of those institutions to go resolve these differences. India and Bangladesh decided together to go do it. And most people would agree that having done that, Bangladesh got the better end of the deal. And India still agreed with the results of the tribunal, of that finding. And oh, by the way, same thing, territorial disputes between Bangladesh and Myanmar, Burma, went to international arbitration. Actually, a really interesting outcome from that. I won't bore you with the details unless you're a lawyer. You can see me afterwards. It'll be a fascinating discussion, I'm sure. But there again, it's resolved. And so the vectors that you see in the vectors of instability are there in the Indian Ocean, just like they are anywhere else. But it's the mechanisms by which they're being resolved that results in the stability that we see. Moving off to the third point on the distributed lethality piece, and I give Tommy Roden credit for this, although he would be quick to say that there are others that were thinking along the same concepts. Again, he's the one that put it into action. So I want to talk just really shortly about distributed lethality. Distributed lethality is not, the concept is fairly new, but we've actually been doing it, and we should take credit for it. So NIFCA, is distributed lethality. You heard SecDef talk about some things that we're doing with SM6, an example of distributed lethality, developing a C-strike capability out of SM6. You look at the things that we're doing across all of the domains that we have, not just the surface domain, but the air domain as well. Upgrades that we're doing with multiple weapon systems. Interesting things that we're doing with TLAM, for instance, is about thinking about the problem differently. As the Secretary said, we don't have the luxury of just one opponent or the choices between two opponents. We've got to get after future fights in a collective sense. He talked about 5 issues that Chairman Dempsey was just in Hawaii last week and mentioned the same challenges in the context of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and then the ISIL threat that we face. People say, well, gee, what do you think the biggest threat is? I would love to live in a world where I could focus on the biggest threat. I used to have a top 10 list. I've got like a top 100 list, and I don't have the authorities to prioritize it. Someone has a vote out there that's reprioritizing that list for me minute to minute. I think that's the point that the Secretary was getting at. As a joint force, we have to get after that spectrum of threats out there, which is why he used the term full spectrum, using the full spectrum of military power to get after those threats, which is where I come from when I talk about full spectrum dominance. Now, I want to be clear about the term dominance. I'm not saying that we are dominant, but that is a goal that we should shoot for. And we should have an understanding, a metric, if you will, of where we are on that scale of dominance. And when I say spectrum, I'm not talking about the electronic spectrum, which is where most people go to mentally when I have that discussion. I'm talking spectrum across from space to the seafloor, across all the communities that we have within our naval forces, to include the communities that make up the Marine Corps, to include the Joint Force. I'm not a Joint Force commander, but I've certainly got joint brothers and sisters, and Vince Brooke and Lori Robinson and John Toolin. I'll throw Vince Atkins, who's the Coast Guard commander, that's traveling with me as well. That's what I mean about full spectrum. So this great work that's happening with distributed lethality at the tactical level and the low operational level, what's the context that pulls that all together at the mid-operational level and strategic level? And that's that full spectrum dominance that we need to get after as leaders at my level to better understand how do we synchronize those fires. Secretary talked about new thinking is required. He talked about the long look. My look is not as long as his. I look in 2 time periods. One is here and now. What does the fight look like today with the forces that I have? And then I look 3 years out, and then expand time windows around those 2 time periods. But the stuff that I'm going to get 3 years from now, it's on its way. So I should be thinking about how are we going to apply that in a warfighting sense. Now, my N9 thinks beyond that. He thinks in the out years, and I spend time talking with the N9 about that. But that engagement occurs up to the OpNav staff and the CNO. And then that ties back in as well with the CNO's design. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. CNO is going to be participating in a couple of panels, and I'll leave it to him to describe that. But it is absolutely synchronized. I mean, it shouldn't be lost on anybody that it took 3 to 4 months for the CNO to publish his design, and it was because from day one he started engaging with his flag and SES wardroom to have a discussion about what should that design be. So it shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody that these thoughts are completely integrated. My thoughts as far as full spectrum dominance, Tommy's thoughts, and the other TICOMs and the other CSG commanders in the terms of distributed lethality. So full spectrum dominance. Let me close on this point. So I mentioned what Tommy's doing with his 3-ship SAG. So no good deed goes unpunished. So I said, gee, I mentioned that WASP is getting out there. We're going to have JSF Bravos on it. hey, Tommy, you did this great thing. You had these 3 independent deployers. You pulled them together as a SAG. What if we did the same thing when WASP was out and about with JSF on it? And we took that 3-ship SAG of independent deployers and attached them to WASP and called it something like an upgunned ESG. If you look at that COCOM demand signal on U.S. naval forces, we need 15 carrier strike groups. Now, don't do math in public, I'm an aviator, but we're a little bit short. Now, we went through this process in the past when we took ESGs and we put flag officers in charge of it. We put some generals, Marine generals in charge of them as well. And the experiment failed magnificently. And that's okay. That's about innovation. So we should take those lessons learned and apply them today. Well, what's different about today? Well, what's different about today is we got V-22, which has revolutionized amphibious warfare. So the Marine vernacular is STOM, Ship to Objective Maneuver. So now you take V-22 and what it's done with our amphibious forces now, add JSF to it with what we're going to have on our big deck amphibs, and I think you've got STOM on steroids. So let's go out and experiment with it. I don't know what the C2 is going to look like. But that's okay. That's about that velocity of that high velocity learning that CNO's talking about. It's getting out there and experimenting and thinking about what the problem set as SecDef talked about. It's about third fleet forward. It's that innovative thinking and let's try some ideas and get out there with that thinking. Okay, let me close with a discussion about how industry can help. I can't tell you how frustrating it is when somebody comes to me, not just industry, but anybody, and they bring me a widget and say, this is going to rock your world, it's going to change your life. And my first question is, tell me about my life. It's not a rhetorical question, because I'm not sure I understand the threats that we have out there. I want that dialogue, that back and forth. But invariably, the discussion ends at that point, because we haven't had that connection. For reasons that we all understand, and good reasons as well, that are well-founded on errors that have been made in the past. But we've got this rule set in place, this barrier that prevents us from talking through it between industry and what I would describe as warfighters. The 4 elements that I drive into the staff on a daily basis, this idea of how do we get away from moving crisis to crisis? How do we get away from being reactive and not being satisfied with just being proactive, but getting to predictive? And there's 4 points that I talk about. First thing is we need to be thoughtful. So when you get a problem handed to you, it doesn't mean it's yours. You don't have to take it. It's fine to say, that's not my problem. That should be handled at a more subordinate level, or I'm not resourced for it, whatever it may be. So feel free to take the time to think and be thoughtful about the problem set. The next step is to be consistent. Because we jump from crisis to crisis, we are so inconsistent in our response. We're being defined by the crisis as opposed to us defining the crisis. We're just giving up that trade space. So we need to be thoughtful, we need to be consistent, and we need to be firm. It's okay to change, but we shouldn't be whipsawing back and forth with new strategies and new policies all the time. We need to be firm in our commitment to the things that we do. And then the last thing is we need to be patient. Had a really interesting discussion with an individual that had been on my staff, obviously for a little while, about some of the things that I was talking about that we should be thinking of from an operational perspective, a strategic perspective. And the comment was, that's the same thing Admiral Blair was saying when he was here at Pac Fleet. If you want a new idea, read an old book. And that's kind of where we are. So feel free to be patient. A lot is changing every day in the Pacific. But when you look at the big stuff, a lot of those challenges are the same. So with that in mind, if I've got an open door policy, so if part of industry, you come and see me with your ideas. Now, Fonz is here someplace, my EA, who's reaching for the PSA's gun to shoot me. So I got to schedule through him time to call my wife. So good luck getting to see me. I got to be characterize access that you have to me. But I'm absolutely serious in that context. We're going to do over 40 experiments of some, I'm using that term broadly, during RIMPAC. So I want industry to look at the Pacific Fleet as a laboratory. So we do exercises all the time. If you've got something that's interesting, let's get lawyers together to work for us, because you don't want to have whatever it is that your program that you're developing, you don't want that contested if you go into a competition to develop it with the Navy and you win that competition because you had unfair advantage because you talked to the Pacific Fleet commander. So we can work through those challenges as opposed to just saying, I'm not going to talk to you. I'm not going to have that discussion. So I keep a list, the staff keeps a list of people that come see me. This is how I manage it with the lawyers, because I got to make sure that I'm fair and equal and I give everybody a fair chance. So we just keep track of the list, and if somebody has come to see me 10 times and other people haven't come to see me at all, we start to diminish the individuals that have come to see me 10 times, more proactive, their schedule just worked out, luck of the draw, whatever it may be. That's how you manage the equity piece in my mind. The last thing I'll say before I open it to questions, SecDef was very clear. He said, think about the tools that you have in your toolbox and how you are going to apply them to the problem set that you're facing today. That's what I heard him say. Now, people come, they're telling me all the time, you need this tool in your toolbox. My question is, let's get to the problem set. That's the discussion that I want to have with industry. I want to describe my problem set to you and allow you, with that knowledge, to go off and apply that great technology, the engineering experience, all the other elements, the resources that you have at your disposal to develop a series of tools that actually match the problem set that I have. And oh, by the way, in that dialogue, I might actually discover something about my problem set that I didn't understand otherwise. So let me stop at that point and open the floor for questions that any of you may have. Who's going to be the first brave soul out there?
Thank you, Admiral. It's an honor to hear you speak today. Quick question. What are the thresholds for the use of force in the PAC fleet area of operations? How are we communicating that to our allies and adversaries? And do our allies and adversaries have confidence that we will actually act on those?
It's a great question. I would invite you to go talk to our allies and friends, allies, and adversaries, as you describe it, as to their view of our commitment. It's part of the comment of the 4 elements I talked about. That's why I think it's important to be firm. It's a little bit easier question to answer on the use of force. You know, all United States forces that are deployed around the world always have the inherent right of self-defense, and that's where we reside. That's what we rely on. But being thoughtful is important, that first tenet. So I think it's important to put in context what my view is of what's going on in the theater. Our Qs, the Code for Unalerted Encounters at Sea that we've gone through and negotiated with multiple nations in the region, it's really a mechanism to get to that broader dialogue. And the dialogues that are occurring between our bridges, the bridges of our ships and other ships out there of other countries, is very collegial. I mean, the COs are talking about the challenges of raising children. What school do they want to? Aspirations, career aspirations for the future, aspirations for their families. Questions about what it's like to live in your society compared to what it's like to live in my society. So I think that context is important to keep in mind as well. I'll go back to something else that Secretary Carter said. He made it very clear. My words are a little bit different context than his. I expand out norms and laws to norms, standards, rules, and laws. But the United States Navy certainly, and I think the rest of the forces as well, are going to continue to operate guided by international law, not necessarily by laws of an individual country, certainly where they don't align with what the international rule set is. I will say, to the last point I'll touch on in response to your question. As I talk to our allies, friends in the region and partners, there is a sense of angst out there, a sense of uncertainty about what is next. And I often get asked about the commitment of Pacific Fleet in particular. When you talk about the 60% and the numbers of aircraft and all the rest of that, and invariably what I get back is the hand raking, and I say, yeah, all that's great, but what can you bring more? More presence. And I've come to the conclusion that I think if the entire United States Navy was home ported in the South China Sea, what I would hear from countries in the region, that's all great, but can you bring more? It's not so much a reflection of what we're doing as the United States. It's a reflection of the angst that's in the region about the uncertainty of the future, the instability that's resonant there today. So from that perspective, I think we're in a good place. When you look at the exercises that we participate in, it'd be a great question to tee up my good friend Admiral Takai here, who's going to sit on a panel, I think, moderated by Admiral Stavridis, if I've got that right. No, I'm sorry, Admiral Fargo is going to moderate that panel. So that'd be a great question to bring up there for his perspective. But yes, sir.
Good afternoon, Admiral. Excuse me. My name is Everett Hayes. I work for AMSEC. Sir, I wanted to get your thoughts on how we plan to do forward maintenance for ships out operating in the Pacific. Some time ago, long time ago, we had shipyards in Philippines and that kind of thing. But to keep that force ready to fight, what do you see as a development? Where do you see that development happening? And then the other part of my question is just, recently we had to fly over of a drone in Straits of Hormuz, and I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the upcoming threat as it pertains to Iran and our relationship there.
Yeah. I don't want to presuppose to speak for my good friend Kid Donegan on the challenges that he's facing as the NAVCENT Fifth Fleet Commander. But I'll touch a little bit on that. And then you clarified your question for me when you said, from a warfighting perspective, on logistics and how do we do ship repair, because they're two very different problems. I've got a problem here and now today in Phase 0, and it's a throughput problem. We are maxed out. In fact, I'm going to go visit the shipyards while I'm here in San Diego, either today or tomorrow. I'm not sure what I'm doing in the next 10 minutes, but to get to that point, so I'm concerned about throughput, and that, in fact, I just had a discussion with CNO last night, is, we got this plus up on FTEs, we're coming up on, the view was we need to increase shipyard force to around 34,000. It was down, a little bit below that. I'm still not sure if that's what the right number is. Some of the implications of sequestration are going to be with us for a while. Government shutdown, that impact's going to be with us for a while. That really destabilized the workforce. It shook people's confidence, and people were not paid. I was DNS when it happened, and there's a large part of the OPNAV staff that is civilian sailors. They didn't get paychecks for a couple of weeks. They weren't able to make house payments. And there's two groups that I put them in. One is the younger crowd that had the opportunity to go do something else because they weren't that long into their careers, and a lot of them walked. And then there's those that were eligible for retirement but planned on sticking around longer, but decided to go ahead and retire and then pursue a vocation, a second career elsewhere. And then you've got the men and women in the middle that weren't quite there for retirement, but they were heavily invested, so they stuck around and continued to serve. That's impacting us on our ability to maintain ships, and it's going to take a while to get through it. But we are at capacity. What I need is more people, not more shipyards. But to your point on the warfighting piece, that's the Phase 0 discussion. On the Phase 2 and Phase 3 discussions, I'm very focused. In fact, I'm getting ready to send a message to the fleet on fleet logistics and what it looks like in a major Phase 2, Phase 3 warfight. I think some of the answer is in a float forward staging basis. That term to me is a little bit too constraining. In the Pacific, if you're not mobile, you're not relevant. You've got to be moving. If you're not moving, you're going to get targeted, and you're going to get targeted from a long, long ways away. You'll know it when the warhead comes down on you. And that is true of our logistics force as well. So we've got to get after that in a real way. So Admiral Skubik in the force shop is all over that from a planning perspective, and that is a holistic planning effort. My whole planning team is focused on getting after that logistics challenge. So the mission functions tasks that are associated with logistics, we're executing those in phase 0, make sure that we have those skill sets. But the structure that we're going to have to turn to in a major phase 2, phase 3 warfight, we're off planning that piece. And I don't want to go into too much detail, but we've got a plan to do that in a mobile sense. Jerry.
Yes, sir. Quick question about the innocent passage operations in the South China Sea. I noted that both with the Lassen as well as the Curtis Wilbur operation, that both of those ships conducted those exercises as innocent passage, as opposed to things we had done in the past, which was operating in the normal military mode. Are there any plans, perhaps after the Philippines adjudication at the tribunal, to return to operations in the normal military mode for these freedom of navigation operations?
Yes. Next question. So great question, Jerry. So some of this is frustrating on my part in, just speaking frankly, at Pac Fleet, we lost control of the message for the Lassen piece. We didn't get out there and describe exactly what we're doing. Now, my view is innocent passage was absolutely the right mechanism to use to challenge those excessive claims. Now, I'm going to describe excessive claims. Don't think I'm thinking about the territorial baseline. And this, apologize to some of the crowd that may not be quite up to speed on UNCLOS and the legal definition of territorial claims and what constitutes it. I think that we were better on message control, getting the message out there on the Curtis Wilbur. But innocent passage was the right way to do it. What was different about the Curtis Wilbur thing is we described what we were challenging, and there were 2 challenges. I'm not going to go beyond the scope of my authorities to talk about the specifics of the countries, but it would be unfair not to recognize there were multiple country claims that were being challenged with both those transits. The elements within both the Lassen Freedom of Navigation operation and the Curtis Wilbur Freedom of Navigation was a requirement to either seek authority before you could enter territorial waters or to announce your intention to enter territorial waters. Agnostic on whether it was territorial waters or not, we weren't commenting on that. Those countries were claiming it. We weren't challenging that element of the claim. What we're challenging is the fact of prior authorities needed to be sought and approved, or prior notification. That's what the legal precedence was. And that's not unlike, we've done over 40 freedom of navigation ops around the world, I think in the past year. So this isn't something that's unique. What is unique is that we're reporting them in real time. Normally what we do is we do a roll-up report on a yearly basis. I would advocate to do that on a quarterly basis. But the mechanisms that we execute those fawn ops are not unlike what we did with Lassen or what we did with Curtis Wilbur. Now, to your point, there have been operations that are excessive baseline claims where we don't think that countries have calculated what the baseline is if it goes around a strait or if there's an isthmus that's involved. And there, to your point, I think is what you're getting at. It's not a straight and a timely passage. I've got the legal description wrong, but there's a turn that's made, something that indicates that it's not just innocent passage. I'm not going to comment on what future freedom of navigation ops that we may be doing, or if it's connected with any decision that may be occurring in the near term in the theater. But I think it's been made clear that we will continue to conduct freedom of navigation ops in the future. But it's a national decision at this point, rightfully so, because of the implications that are at play. So I would defer to Admiral Harris to better address, what the periodicity and the timing is. All I can say is that the Pacific Fleet is ready. I mean, we are an extensive force that's prepared to conduct, the spectrum of operations at any given time, really at a moment's notice. It speaks to the readiness of the fleet. This is way too easy. No other questions out there? Comments?
Admiral, here.
Yeah.
Voice of America, Libo Liu. You earlier spoke of risk averse, some people describing that, but were you referring to military commanders or our civilian leaders or both?
It's culturally. I think we're, from a cultural perspective, I think we're too risk adverse. The challenge that I see in the Pacific is it's a very different challenge than what we faced in OAF and OIF. As has been pointed out, I think Secretary Carter framed it well when he talked about we've got two peer competitors out there, both in Russia and China, with a great lack of understanding of exactly what their intent is, a lack of transparency. And that's what's driving angst into the theater. But when I talk about risk aversion, I'm talking about from me on down into the fleet. So there's a series of messages that I'm putting out that talks about, again, beyond the scope of this audience probably, but if you think of commodity, things that you want to own as a warfighter, the number one commodity is time. That you want to be able to accelerate the warfight when it's to your advantage, and if you are disadvantaged, you want to decelerate the warfight. So that's the commodity, what you want to own. The currency that you trade that commodity in, how you buy more time or you sell more time, that's risk. So if you want to accelerate the warfight, you're going to burn more fuel, you're going to work your force harder, you're going to expend more ordnance than what you planned on. You're accruing risk in the gamble that the return on that investment, that increase in risk, is going to manifest itself in reaching a culminating point in your plan earlier than what you had anticipated on. That's why I talk about the risk piece. So when I look at the force, I look at people that are unwilling to take chances. Tommy Rowden, we got 3 independent deployers. Let's pull them together as a SAG and send them on cruise. How do you command and control that? Who do you put in charge? What does that do from the logistics perspective? So that's what we need to embrace. I mean, that's how we get to be innovative. I mean, I went to Silicon Valley and I heard stunning things. I heard things like fail fast, fail early. I mean, they use fail in the same sentence twice. I mean, I hadn't been exposed to that in I don't know how long. When I talked about the ESG process that we had been through before, that was a failure, a wonderful failure. We need to experience more things like that so now we can apply those lessons learned as we march off on this new path that's enabled by V-22, it's enabled by JSF, it's enabled by maritime thinkers like Tommy Rowden. It's taking a look at what he has in his toolbox now, and at no added cost to me as the Pacific Fleet Commander is saying, how can we approach this in an innovative way? So that risk aversion prevents us from getting to the things that the CNO is talking about from the velocity of learning perspective. It prevents us from getting to the things that SecDef is talking about, that new thinking is required. We need to enable that thinking. We learn by making mistakes. And yet if we're so averse to making mistakes, if we punish people as soon as they make mistakes, learning's it's just not gonna happen. The arena that you have to operate in is absolutely gonna shrink down. So, what other questions?
Hi, Admiral. Sir, with regards to the overall strategy of the Navy, we talk about specific things about the existence of the Navy, but when enemies are not addressing the actual strategy of the Navy, but using like artificial islands to undercut the fundamental premise for not naval domination, but the fundamental existence of a Navy, what are we doing to actually address that when it attacks the fundamental axiom for the existence of the Navy?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this, Pete, will probably be the last question because I sense this is going to take a little while to answer. But it's a great question. I want to go back and touch, as part of answering that question, on the issue that was raised with Iran flying UAVs. My response would be, okay, let's be thoughtful about this. So it's in the media about, in fact, Secretary Kerry made the comment this morning about the HQ-9 missile system being deployed to Woody Island. As an example of some of the challenges, and I think Secretary Kerry made the comment that President Xi had made the comment in the Rose Garden that they weren't going to militarize the islands. China wasn't going to militarize the islands. And in fact, the Minister of Defense was just visiting China yesterday or the day before, and China made the comment after that visit that China wanted to demilitarize the islands, and then the very next day, there's this news report that HQ-9s are going out there. So I think the first thing is to be thoughtful. Let's think more deeply about the problem set. So the fact of the matter is that HQ-9s have been out on Woody Island before, twice before that I know of. Both times have been associated with exercises. So that context is important. In that context, this isn't exactly something that's new. It's also important to note that in one of those exercises, they actually exercised the weapon system itself and shot down a drone. So there's an end-to-end test that the system is operational and it works. What's different about this deployment is it's not associated with an exercise. So the real question is, what's the intent? How long is it going to be there? Is this a permanent forward deployment of this weapon system or not? So it's a series of questions that we need to generate and ask ourselves. What's the intent with respect to these islands that are being built in the South China Sea? It's about lighthouses, and is it that the lighthouses needed to be defended, or are the lighthouses an excuse to militarize the islands? That's the dialogue that is occurring in the broad context and the description that we need to come to. But as far as challenging naval forces, we go through this exercise process of introspective looks and extrospective looks as to what should the Navy be. I'm an aviator. I'm not here to defend carriers. That's Shu's job. But I'm really interested in what I have in my toolbox, and part of my toolbox is carriers. So we're going through this dialogue about what cost of carriers. That's significant that we need to get after. The taxpayers are paying a significant chunk of money for each carrier that we buy. So there's this dialogue that what's the right size of carrier? Maybe the carrier should be smaller, to the point that it's not directly related to what's going on in the South China Sea, but it's certainly directly related to a competitor out there like China that has a weapon system like a DF-21 and soon to be a DF-26. I don't view any of those things as changing my world specifically as far as what's in my toolbox. Remember the time frame. I talk about here and now as one time frame, and then it's a separate leap when I jump into what's the world look like 3 years from now. And I'm very comfortable with the resources and capabilities, capacity that I have to face the threat within that window. I don't like the term A2AD. A2AD is a defensive approach to an offensive plan, and yet it's a cost-imposing strategy applied by your adversary. And my concern is we're embracing it by throwing money at it, exactly what an adversary would want you to do. And we use a term of, A2AD, DF-21, SA-20, shredders. Those are game changers. And yet we never change the game. The first thing that we need to do is to go change the game. Think about the problem from a philosophical perspective and how might we come up with a better plan that negates those defensive systems that were designed to counter a different plan. So the same issue is with these size of carrier arguments. I listen to those things with interest. I like to think that I'm an informed thinker. But as I listen to those dialogues, I ask myself the question, okay, so if we're going to go with a smaller carrier, what's the delta in cost? The last time I checked, we're not buying carriers by weight. It's a valid argument that we have more deck space than we had in the past. But I lived through that pain cave of we could not afford all the different type model series that we had in naval aviation. We had A6s, we had S3s, we had A7s, we had F8s, we had Tomcats, S3s. I mean, we had this dog's breakfast of an air wing out there, and it was killing us trying to maintain it. So the concept was, let's go down to a single type model series. So we can go back to a series of schools, a series of publications, a training regimen that is as consistent as it can be between weapon systems. Now, there is some delta between the weapon systems, obviously with the Growler, with the Legacy Hornets and the Super Hornets. But we went about that in a thoughtful way, and that gave us extra deck space. So, okay, maybe we can make the carrier smaller. How much smaller? So how much magazine space do we need? How much fuel do we need? Part of my idea is I want that carrier as a fuel station in order to refuel a force. Do we make the landing area shorter? If we make the landing area shorter, we've got to redesign the Air Force, because that airframe is designed to take the arrestment forces of what the run out is today. So if we're going to make the landing area shorter, you get these cascading effects that I start asking questions as the guy that's going to have to implement this plan to say, whoa, 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 wait a minute. How are we going to make this work? Well, okay, well, let's leave the landing area the same size. Let's make the catapult shorter. Okay, well, we've got to redesign the nose gear and that whole structure that takes all that force of the catapult, spreading it throughout the airframe. Otherwise, we're going to stop launching airplanes other than the nose gear off the pointy end of carriers. So it goes back to the discussion of making myself more open to that dialogue with whatever it may be, academics, industry, to have this discussion about what is the threat environment that we see and how do we get after that threat environment. That was what I heard in the 2 February speech from SecDef. If you haven't read that speech, I would encourage you to Google it and read it in detail, because it spoke to me, it resonated with me, because it aligned to my thinking. So I'm seeking people that it didn't align with to inform my thinking. All right, Pete's given me the hook. I really appreciate the opportunity to the entire West team for this opportunity to come speak to you today. And I hope what you get from all of these opportunities from the speakers is a series of sidebars that generates from this. So your ideas, your criticisms, I don't get it, I disagree. I'm looking for those alternative views. I'm not looking for people that think exactly like I do, because that's a path to failure. I'm looking for people that challenge my thinking as to what we should be doing from a Pacific Fleet perspective and the challenges that we face in the Indo-Asia Pacific. So, Pete, thanks a lot. I got a book to do that, right?
Admiral, thank you so much for taking time out from your very busy schedule to come over and deliver those very thoughtful remarks and also make extra time to take questions from the audience. It means the world to us to have this kind of interaction. We've got a book for you, a Naval Institute Press book, Toward a New Maritime Strategy by Peter Haynes. It contains an FCA bookmark, and the two organizations, Naval Institute and FCA, appreciate your remarks here today very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. Thanks for all you're doing, too. I appreciate it.